Welcome back. We are still looking at the latest developments out of the Middle East. A short time ago, the Qatari government saying that there's been an agreement in principle, at least for a 2-day extension of the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Israel, at this point, yet to confirm through their official channels whether they are fully in support of the deal. But the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking as recently as yesterday when he was in Gaza, did say that Israel is open to the extension of the ceasefire in the main because they want to get each and every one of their hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th out of Gaza. Well, Hamas, for its part, has said that it basically wants to see the further release of Palestinians, women and young men, basically teenagers, who are held in the Israeli prisons, released as well, as has been happening since Friday. Humanitarian aid reaching several parts of Gaza is also still an issue. Well, let's get the view now of Human Rights Watch Program Director Sari Bashi. Sari, a very good evening to you. So, those breaking news lines there that I was just reflecting for our viewers. What is the position of Human Rights Watch now that we're hearing what appears to be the first sign of a ceasefire? And we caveat that by saying the Israelis are yet to confirm on their official channels that they're committed to this.
Yeah, I mean, look, any agreement that leads to more civilian hostages being released and to more critically needed humanitarian aid entering Gaza is welcome. But my concern is that both Hamas and the Israeli military are negotiating things that shouldn't be negotiated. They're using civilian lives as pawns in a deal, when the reality is that Hamas and Islamic Jihad need to release all civilian hostages immediately and unconditionally, whether or not the Israeli military allows more aid into Gaza. And the Israeli military has to actively supply Gaza with the full amount of critically needed humanitarian aid, whether or not Hamas and Islamic Jihad release more hostages. These are obligations to civilians, not to warring parties.
And ultimately, the hostages taken by Hamas and the thousands of Palestinians who are being detained by Israel are pawns, aren't they, between the two sides? And ultimately, if the negotiation is going to be around going with a truce until the very last one is released, that means in any effect it will still be a temporary peace because Israel still wants to, in its own words, obliterate, annihilate Hamas.
Yes, I think what people are talking about right now is a temporary ceasefire. And in that context, the parties are taking things that they should be doing anyway and negotiating over them. So it's good news that about 60 hostages have been released, primarily Israeli citizens, but also a number of foreign nationals. And it's good news that more life-saving aid, in particular fuel and cooking gas, has entered Gaza. The humanitarian situation there is quite dire. There's not enough food, clean water, sanitation supplies, medicine. And, you know, so far 117 Palestinian prisoners and detainees have been released, primarily adult women and a number of teenagers. Most of the teenagers were arrested when they were children, and many of them still are children. There's one boy on the list who hasn't yet been released, who's 14. Most of those prisoners were arrested and dealt with as part of a military justice system that operates in the West Bank for Palestinians, but not for Israelis. And it lacks very basic due process protections, including some 2,000 Palestinians who are detained without charge. So we have serious concerns about those due process protections, and we're, of course, glad that some of those children will be able to go home.
And there's a clear-cut case of unlawfulness on the part of Hamas. I mean, going into Israel on October 7th, killing over 1,200 people. That's been condemned, as has been the abduction of these over 200 hostages, some of whom we're hearing have reportedly been killed in Gaza. You mentioned the issue of the Israeli detention of women and children in areas including the West Bank. That has also raised a lot of human rights related questions because as things stand, am I right, many of them have been held, in fact, without charge, and their detention can be extended almost unilaterally, if you will.
Yes. So the Israeli military, or the Israeli authorities, are holding about 7,000 Palestinian security prisoners and detainees, including 2,000 held in what's known as administrative detention, which is detention without charge. So while international humanitarian law, the laws of occupation, do have a narrow provision for exceptional cases of detention without charge, the use of it in a sweeping manner by the Israeli military for more than 5 decades violates very basic due process protections. In terms of the hostages, I mean, look, the massacre that was committed by Hamas-led gunmen on October 7th was a war crime, as was the taking of hostages. And while it's really good news that 60 have been able to go home, the obligation is to release all civilian hostages immediately and unconditionally, whether or not prisoners are released and whether or not more aid comes into Gaza. My concern is that all parties have been flouting very, very basic principles of humanity, which say you have to leave civilians out of the fighting. You can't take them hostage. You can't deny them aid as a bargaining chip.
And just on the suffering of civilians that you've been documenting as Human Rights Watch, as recently as this weekend, you then released a report on the horrific scenes which we saw at the Al-Shifa hospital, where hundreds of people were reportedly killed. You now say that disaster, the tragedy, was caused by a misfired rocket, but you say that in fact it appears to have been a rocket that misfired on the side of the armed groups within the Palestinian territories. Does that mean it was definitely Hamas that was trying to fire that rocket?
No, we don't know who it was. What we found was that the October 17th bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital in northern Gaza was apparently caused by a rocket misfire of the kind used by Palestinian armed groups. We don't know which group. We do know that the Hamas government has has swept away the remnants. Witnesses saw the Ministry of Interior employees removing the remnants from the site, and we've asked the government to produce those remnants, because producing those remnants would let us and others make further determinations. But the concern is that all parties are violating their obligations to civilians. Palestinian armed groups have been firing rockets indiscriminately at Israeli communities, which is a war crime. And in the past, we have documented them also firing rockets from crowded, populated civilian areas inside Gaza, which puts those Palestinian civilians at risk.
The issue of access, of course, to Gaza has been a major one in terms of groups such as yours being able to verify the extent of the atrocities committed on the ground. Unlikely at this stage that any of the sides involved in this conflict will subject themselves to full scrutiny. What does that mean then for the cause of justice? Because there are civilians who've died here by the thousands.
Yeah, well, the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor has an open investigation since 2021 into possible serious international crimes committed in Palestine. And he recently made clear that his investigation also includes what happened on October 7th in Israel. It's been 2 years, and we haven't seen any visible signs of progress. So we would encourage state parties to the court, including South Africa, to fully support the court's investigation, not just into crimes in Israel-Palestine, but all of its investigations. And there I know South Africa had a bit of a patchy patch when it was not as certain about its commitment to the ICC. I think it's really important to maintain commitment to an independent, well-funded, robust ICC prosecutor's office, so that crimes that nobody else will hold people accountable for can be tried at the International Criminal Court.
Sari, Bashi, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time on Newzroom Afrika.